I've always considered them more of a street punk band.
Mm-hmm.
But when I listened to it again over the past week, I was like, man, I think the imagery and the name and the like song titles, it feels street punk. But when I listen to it, it feels more like skate punk and pogo punk to me, like just bouncy, like energetic but melodic and up tempo. Grimple up your ass. Okay, so I did just copy paste some information about the band because I thought, in my infinite wisdom, that they were older than 1990. I thought they were a 1980s band.
Mm-hmm.
And as far as I can tell here, I was wrong. I always thought that Operation Ivy was influenced by GRIMPLE. I think it was the opposite. I think they were heavily influenced by Operation Ivy.
Right, and then Rancid would claim to be influenced
by GRIMPLE.
Right, and I think that's why I think of them as an 80s band because I've not spent a lot of time listening to them over the years, but all the bands I like always liked them. So they're just kind of influential right before like a lot of the stuff got really, really big. So NoFX was always citing them, and the Rancid camp was always citing them. And
Rancid definitely incited them.
Yeah, so I think like we think of them, and their sound is a very 80s sound in a lot of ways. So I think that's why we think of them as being older than they were, where they're more actually kind of contemporaries. They're just sort of like proto like melodic hardcore or that kind of thing.
Right.
You know what I mean? They kind of had that before that was really like a sound. They were kind of fooling with it, and they're like one of the bands that I think these other bands later on, like the skate bands and the hardcore bands, kind of took from and put like their spin on.
That's kind of the thing about this band. They have a guitar tone, and like they're specifically the sound of their instruments sound like Operation Ivy, but I guess that's by design. And I just had it flip flopped. I've always really appreciated this one album.
Mm-hmm.
But I've never been like an expert on the band, and that's one of the things I've been doing with my channel is I've been going back and like a band or an album that I really love. I've been learning about it backwards because when I was younger, man, I just like, oh, this is good in the CD player. I never cared to look into it because it was so much work to find out information back then. And then by the time it got to where the internet was around, I didn't have a computer until I was in my mid-20s, dude. Like I was never a tech guy. I was living in punk houses, so like we would talk about bands sometimes, but not enough for me to like really learn about them, man. We were too busy playing our own shows. So that's the thing is people go, oh, you didn't know anything about your music that you listened to when you were growing up. It's like, no, dude, I was too busy going to shows, playing shows, setting up merch booths and all that stuff that I didn't dive into the history of it. I was active in my scene at a very young age. So I'd never had the time to, like when we would sit around. Okay. So like, since I was involved with bands, so your normal punk rock group of people, right, that are just like going to shows and stuff, you very well might sit around and open up CD booklets and talk about these bands and discuss history and the way an album was made or whatever, right? And we did that to a very small degree, but we were sitting around talking about like, hey man, can you help me make these shirts? Hey, can you help me design this? Hey, what are we doing about this song? Hey, let's go practice. I was in that part of it. So like we didn't sit around and talk about music like we do now. And so, I don't know. I just wanted to preemptively say this because people get so upset about my lack of historic knowledge. I just never cared about that, man. I do now, and I'm learning about it now. But I don't know. It seems to be something that really offends people, and I think you got to really like loosen up, man. Like, if that bothers you, first off, oh well. But man, I try not to be a dick about stuff, and people just force me into that corner. That being said, I was saying that to describe like I never really knew a lot about this band other than I loved their vocals. I loved their guitar tone. I loved the sonic noise I heard from this record. And this is the one that stuck with me. And it's because it's the more melodic of the two. It is very much more, I mean, it's honestly, they sound like two different bands. So
yeah, this one's more, it's closer to what like a skate punk would become.
Yes.
Versus, I think the album that I dove into, the LP was more crossover thrash. I think you would
very much more into that.
Yeah, and I think that album, because I have a lot of notes on that LP. It's more of like a I was trying to do this analogy a couple weeks ago. There's like the difference between like a salad and a melting pot when it comes to like influence. And I think like GRIMPLE on the second album, it's much more of a salad. There's just like all of a sudden there's like a part from some new wave of British heavy metal, and then there's like a skate punk part, and then there's like a melodic part, and then there's like a Casualties part, and then there's like a Fugazi part. It's not really one coherent sound. The first album is more of a coherent sound,
Correct.
Which is more in line again with just like I always thought of GRIMPLE more as like San Francisco hardcore.
Interesting.
And I think the earlier album is more like the San Francisco punk that we think of, which I didn't know. I feel really stupid. They were from Santa Fe originally, which I had no idea.
I was gonna bring. Well, they moved to Oakland in like 1990.
Yeah, and so in my brain, they were always like when I think of San Francisco hardcore, I think of like them. I think of them. I think of that writing, the logo, and all that. So I think of like the hardcore bands that were just kind
wonderful logo.
Yeah, the like MySpace 2005 metal logo that they were doing back in the 80s.
Like Filth and Aus-Rotten and stuff, they were all the same.
Yeah,
like ilk. You know, you got those bands, in my opinion, are all in the same batch.
I associate them more with that as an identity, but this album is again much more in the line of the stuff that we talk about and the later melodic stuff. It just kind of comes out in 91. I mean, think about it. Like Suffer comes out in like 89, Operation Ivy 88. So there's still not a lot of like precedent for like melodic hardcore yet. You know what I mean? It's still kind of. I would say
this is one of the, what do you call that? Like foundational points of that kind of music.
I agree, especially when it came out and then how popular they were. It's just like it's a proto version of the sound later. It's not quite there yet, but it's.
I've always considered them more of a street punk band.
Mm-hmm.
But when I listened to it again over the past week, I was like, man, I think the imagery and the name and the like song titles, it feels street punk. But when I listen to it, it feels more like skate punk and pogo punk to me, like just bouncy, like energetic, but melodic and up tempo. They don't have a lot of dark sounds in their first album. Now that's the thing, is that's why I don't really listen to the second album much.
Uh-huh.
It's a lot more confusing. It's not as coherent. It's not it's not one like cohesive sound. It's quite a bit more. Like you said, it's more like
I guess you would say no. So the first album, one of the notes I have here is they're like the California Casualties is what I have, because they have that's kind of casualty, and Casualties are fairly melodic as well, but it's kind of like those type of songs, and he kind of has like a bit of Jorge's way of like going through it and stuff, but it's got a little bit of the silliness, a little bit of the California, a little bit of that melodic kind of surfside sort of just infused in it just a little bit. And then like the other album, this is so funny, I did like a distribution of influences of how I felt it was. So I said it was like
it's awesome.
30% LA hardcore, and just that's like a general term for LA punk, but like a lot of the there's like a lot of the
punk fast.
And then even like the Black Flag and the sludgier stuff. They have those, like the Rollin stuff, and then 30% LA thrash, like legit LA thrash metal, and then 20% generic punk from different scenes in the 80s. So you hear a little bit of Washington, a little Fugazi, a little New York, a little bit of a hint of the melodic stuff. And then I have 20% generic metal subgenres from Black Sabbath all the way up to like Pantera, because there's parts on the other album.
On the second album, right?
Yeah, where he's doing like almost like a Phil Anselmo type of like a vocal delivery over like a skate punk stuff. But it's not like the stuff later, because like a lot of the Fat Record stuff is the skate punk is the metal influence, but transitioned into like a punk sound. They're kind of doing that here, but it's not as smooth. It's just all of a sudden we're going to go into the Diamond Head part in the middle of what started out as like a Pennywise song that then has a really slow Black Flag part like right over here. It feels like it's unproduced, maybe would be the way to think of it.
Well, like the band just got in there and it was like, here's what we've got. And the guy that was behind the board was like, cool, hit record.
Do that. And it might have been a choice. Again, we don't know. Like I kind of, because they're as small as they are, I almost don't care to know. I almost like the fact that it just kind of exists like this and want to see what it is.
I am an eternally curious person, and I want to know. I would love to talk to that band. Anybody from that band, I would love to talk to and just get some insight as to like, how did it happen? Where did it come from? Because their sound at that point in time, listen, man, I can figure out where they got some Operation Ivy influence from, but they were, even to this day, they have a more unique sound. They don't sound like other bands. That's why I like that album so much. is because it's got its own thing going on.
I have a hypothesis.
Excellent. I'm all ears.
I think it's the Santa Fe factor, and I'm serious about this.
Okay.
Because, and you maybe relate to this a little bit, when you don't live in like cool places, you kind of are exposed to everything, and like there's not necessarily a distinction always between like the punks and the metal guy. It's just kind of like the alternative people who would have kind of got and received all
that. Makes sense.
That doesn't surprise me that they're sort of deploying all of that. Whereas maybe if you're a California kid, you really can, like if you're a Lookout guy, you really like the poppier stuff, or if you're like a crackhead, you really like the LA stuff, or you know what I mean? Like you can really you can zero in on what you like.
Hey, look, dude, disclaimer here, man. I do not feel that way about LA punk rock. I love LA punk rock, but it is a little more on the I say like sharp side. Like there's a little more danger in LA. I mean, I know you were being silly, but
LA feels more like gangster music, so to speak, in that way.
It's definitely a little more like boots on the ground, man. It's a little scarier there. But like I feel like I was in Houston specifically was really dangerous back then too. So I feel like not quite as bad as LA, but like I feel like I could have been like, all right, them's my people right there.
Well, Houston's not exactly it's the safest place on earth.
No, dude, it's not. But and we, in all of our clubs were in the heart of downtown. So like when we would go out, man, we would get the shit kicked out of us by like random people that you would not expect to be messing with you. Like at least in the early 90s, mid 90s, when I was young, started going out, I was very naive, man. I was like rival, no business.
Rival punk gangs there, or was it
just
generic gangs? Yeah, like because I think that's the difference between California probably and other places is like the punk gangs are warring with each other.
Well, no, we had North Side punks and South Side punks for sure. Houston is a humongous place, just square mileage. And I remember, I think the band was called PWI. I might be mistaken. Now in like adult days, we're all cool. We see each other out and about. It's like, what's up, dude? How you been, man? Like we were all 17 to 20. We're idiots, man. But there was the Arm in Arm guys on the north side. I lived in that punk house. We lived in the Arm in Arm house in Copperfield. Anybody that's from Houston will know exactly what I'm talking about. And then there was, I think it was the PWI guys, and it was just like rival factions, bro. We just didn't get along. We couldn't seem to like get on the same bill. There was always like this band trying to snipe this slot on the show that's coming through town, and like, it just caused a lot of drama because, dude, you didn't have the way to communicate back then that we do now. You couldn't. We didn't have the same cars. Like, we couldn't just drive across town. Dude, can you imagine what it was like for a 19-year-old punk rock kid who was like living on his own, barely scraping by, to try to go to a show that was 35 miles away, but in the same city? Like, think about that. It was
you're just going to be natural crazy. To your habitat. Like,
so
that's what you're going to do.
So we absolutely had like literal, like the guy I had on the show is going to have his episode come on today. His name's John. If you guys see the episode with John Hale, first off, please go watch that. He's been my friend since we were 5 years old, dude. And he owns probably the best place in Houston to play punk rock music. And they are just turning the screws on this guy, man. He's getting bent over and fucked, man. So he needs help from the community if we can help. That being said, that's the guy I lived with, bro. I lived with that cat like 20 years ago. And we were at a show. Whenever I tell people the show, the story about, I was at Fitzgerald's once and this girl threw a candle at me and I ducked and it hit my friend in the face. That's the guy I'm talking about. It hit him right in the middle of his eyes and it just burst him open. And that was one of the bigger fights, man. It was chaos, bro. Dude, there was ambulances everywhere, cops everywhere. We were like jumping off the roof of a 2-story venue to get away from the police. My buddy, I think he broke his ankle doing it. Man, it was wild back then because there was no cell phones. We didn't have no pagers, nothing. So we were just like ducking out and running. Hope we can get home. I mean, we were 30 miles from the crib, dude. It was crazy. Anyways, bro, that deviated from the LA punk scene. But it feels like when I think of LA, I think about, man, it was probably a lot like that. Because I know LA's real spread out too. It's concentrated, but it's a big area.
Yeah, and I think there's a specific, like the LA punk specifically that was very in the middle of the city. Like in the 80s, it's considered like the LA punk is like one of the big gangs that's on like the LAPD's like list of like.
Isn't that weird?
Yeah. Well,
to me, it's so stupid because it's just a bunch of kids hanging out.
Yeah, and it really was. And it's like Jim and those guys, and Fat Mike and these guys just kind of going to shows and slam dancing. Now the suicidal tendencies, that's a little bit different because the suicidals were like, I think just legitimately a street gang in that way,
It definitely, if it wasn't, it definitely had a lot of that influence in it. and I'm not going to put a label on them like that. But everything I've heard, it sounds like that's pretty accurate. Like I don't actually have the information to know. What I've heard is like that's true, but I wasn't there. So.
Which again, and we always bring that up to kind of talk about, to bring it back to what we're talking about here with San Francisco. It's why San Francisco just feels like the relief valve from all of that, and that's where
right. It really does.
Tim comes out, and I know like Fat Mike has said like, oh, you could go have fun at shows in San Francisco, or you could get your teeth kicked in at shows in LA. And it was just,
I've actually heard him say stuff like that. He does say things like that.
A different kind of vibe. And you see a band like GRIMPLE that kind of feels like, even though like, again, their roots are here from Santa Fe to San Francisco, two very similar types of cities generally, though, like two cities that are very much associated with each other. But it feels like it smells like it kind of comes out of LA the way.
Well, so here's the thing, except that it's got this air of good times. You know what I'm saying? Especially with GRIMPLE Up Your Ass. It's got this like feel of like, it feels like a show. The whole list of songs, if you listen to it front to back, it feels like a set list almost, man. And you compared them a little bit to like the Casualties. The Casualties had more of a rah, 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 like anger and pissed off. Whereas I feel like GRIMPLE might have been a little younger than that. So they weren't quite as concerned with that kind of stuff. And so they were more upbeat, willing to have some fun. I mean, the album's called GRIMPLE Up Your Ass. And the song is, it's real melodic and upbeat, up tempo. It sounds like you want to pogo dance. It sounds like you want to go skateboard. It sounds like you want to chug a beer.
It's more influenced, and I think a lot of that scene is very influenced by like thrash culture, and just generally, as you said, like skateboarding, kind of like it's very like it's a little cartoony, a little campy.
Oh yeah,
kind of. It's a lot. It seems like it takes
itself serious,
slightly less serious than like the New York stuff. Again, than like
that's kind of what I was talking about.
The Casualty stuff.
The reason I even acquired this was because the guy that gave it to me, and I'm not going to say his name because I'm not 100% sure I got the right guy in mind. I only had a handful of these dudes back in the day, but I'm pretty certain that he was a super staunch political punk type. And I think he was like, not really for me, man. You might like this. And he gave it to me, and I put it in within like 2 or 3 songs. I was like, holy crap, this is my new favorite band. And I listened to that. I wore that CD out, bro. It was so good. I think it was a CD. It might have been a tape, but I think it was a CD. I get that kind of stuff. I get mixed up, man. I had so many of both back in the day. I had a lot of albums on both mediums. I had CD and cassette of a lot of records. So, but GRIMPLE was one that, and I always liked the name. And then they had on, was it A Fucked Up Beautiful Day? That song specifically really like captured what I feel I behave like. It's got a little bit of emotion in it. It's got a little bit of carefree attitude. It's got a lot of that punk rock sound. They even have some like weird guitar chords that sound almost Operation Ivy like in some of their songs. This album really goes well with energy. If you wanted to put an A side, B side together, like I may do that on a video.
It sounds like a show or a party. Like that's the biggest compliment you can give to energy is that it sounds like and it's kind of like and they played, and then next up came GRIMPLE, and you could totally see a very just like a synergy connection between that. Very much music again that's inspired by its surroundings, I think probably.
Let's see. So also I can hear a lot of what became Operation Ivy in this album. ... Oh shit! Wait a minute, I had it backwards. That's like my notes are ridiculous on this. Like I'm not even reading off of them because they're so confusing to even. But it's that's the album came out in '92. It's 15 songs in 23 minutes. Like think about that. Like that is a fast-paced album. That's right up my alley though. Like I want a 23-minute 15-song record. Like that's absolutely what I want.
And you could really, I think, if you do the Rancid connection to like the early like Lookout version of Rancid before they go to Epitaph.
Oh yeah,
it's kind of like a more melodic version of this stuff. But
really, you think so? I think the early Rancid stuff is a more street version of this stuff.
No, but okay,
it's more rough on the edges.
Maybe I'm thinking of the album that I dove into a little more though too.
Maybe yeah.
Of that and that stuff too. Like that album. Has a lot of like the Hellcat sounding stuff, like the hardcore Hellcat sounding stuff sounds a lot like that stuff. Like it's a lot of like the F- and those kind of bands. You could hear a lot of that. and which is just the sound of hardcore really is what it is.
Right.
But the way it's so punk tinged, the way it still has. It's like this seriousness that like you would almost mistake for Slayer, but it's got like the snot of punk rock still in it. It's got a punk rock sort of Johnny Rotten sneer still sort of
Isn't that weird
in its spirit. Yeah. That's why it's cool. Like generally, I always say I don't like hardcore because I always say if I want to listen to that stuff, I'll just listen to metal. But what I think
really?
what those people really are getting at is bands like this that have a lot of the punk feel to it, but just using some of the instrumentation and stuff of metal. Like I think if more hardcore sounded like GRIMPLE, I would be more into hardcore just generally.
Yeah, and I don't consider GRIMPLE hardcore at all. Like I don't. Isn't that funny? It's just I think that there's like these gaps in the description of these sounds and words, and I think I think that the lines are so blurred and it's such a muddy subject. I'm literally doing a video on oi foi. You know what that is?
No.
It's cold oi. It's a whole kind of a new sound, man. It's been around for like there was like little glimpses of it in the 80s and some glimpses of it in the 90s, but in like 2020 it really took off. So I'm having to do like this whole. I'm really putting some work in on this video, so I hope it really takes off. But like, my point is that there's the lines are blurred when you talk about genre, especially one as crazy as punk. Punk rock has look. People can say whatever they want, but there are rules to punk rock. There's rules to everything, man. It's not. Punk rock didn't start out as this political ideology thing. It was a rebellion against the adults. That's what punk rock was. So the fact that people associate it with strictly like a political thing is wild to me. Now, is there political stuff? Absolutely. I would say at this point, probably more of it even. You're associated with punk when you get political. You know what I'm saying? But the lines are just crisscrossed and blurry. So, you could call this hardcore. I don't even hear a hardcore note in this. It's wild, but that doesn't surprise me, and I'm not even arguing that it is. I'm just saying I've never called it that, and
I'm not calling it either. I'm saying if hardcore was like this, I would like it more.
Oh yeah, I mean if hardcore was like this, it wouldn't be hardcore though, right? You know what I'm saying?
Exactly. I guess that's kind of the.
But there are definitely like elements of what people consider hardcore in this music. I just unless we're talking about it, I'm not hearing that. I'm hearing more skate punk than anything. Skate punk and street punk kind of intertwined. It's got a lot of both things. The street punk stuff, but people call that hardcore. So it's again blurry lines, man.
Well, that's why it is though. I always think of convenient. Like if you think of like pop punk being at one end and like hardcore punk being at another, and then skate punk lands kind of in the middle, and we're always sort of doing that like the little slider of where
this one leans a little bit
where it kind of goes. Yeah. It's like
there's a lot of very good poppy. Sorry, I didn't mean to cut you off. Like a lot of great poppy melodic elements in this that I think some of the more like hard-nosed punk guys maybe don't like, but I am attracted to that. I really like that.
Very much a cult band, I would say. That they sort of their band. The people who like them really love them. Like the logos and the patches are more. They're like an underground version of like I'm wearing a Misfits shirt now, where it's like you see these people wearing them and you wonder if they've ever actually listened to them or if it's just kind of a thing. They kind of have that status a little bit.
That's why I'm very adamant about the lack of knowledge I've got, because I don't ever want to be that guy where they go, "Oh, he doesn't know shit." No, I know some. I don't know everything, though, man. I know what I like about it and what I don't like about it. And the only thing I don't like about it is that there's not more of it. Really, that's my real legitimate gripe on that type of music. Let me see here. Go ahead. I'm listening.
You know what? Too, it is unfortunate because a lot of music that became really popular a few years later, a lot of those bands' early music doesn't sound that much different than this. So you might say like, well, this couldn't have never made it big or never would have fit in the 90s. Like, well, like early versions of a lot of these bands wouldn't have fit in the late 90s either. And this is a lot more in line with what those bands did anyway. So to say that like they wouldn't have maybe like hooked up with Brett or something on the next album and had like a huge album, I don't think that you could make that claim. Like, it's something we wouldn't know, but I think it would be very much in play with a band like this.
Well, if you listen to the words on A Fucked Up Beautiful Day, that song, if you just sang it different or played it different, it could have been any number of bands. That could have been a Rancid song. That could have been a NoFX song. That could have been a Sublime song. That could have been a lot of band song. And that's like the first one that really, actually, that's not true. Grimple Up Your Ass, like the title track, is the one that's really stuck with me because it's so catchy. And then and then it stops, "Grimple up your ass," and it goes back into the song. Like that's attention grabbing. That stuck with me. But when I listened to the full album, that other song is the one that really grabbed my attention, and it became the one that I put on all my mixtapes. And there's probably like 80% of this album that has been on my mixtapes. There's only a handful of songs that I don't just truly love, and even the ones I don't love per se are songs I really enjoy.
They're all good. They're all good, like mosh pit songs, like regardless.
So. The whole album's really great. I think we've talked as long as the album is, so I think we should move on. I think okay. So what is your kind of feel on Grimple though before we move on?
Yeah, I give it a solid thumbs up. It's not something I would ever like skip if it came up in a shuffle. I don't know how often I would necessarily go to these albums as a whole, because I like a lot of other stuff that's more like influenced by it. But again, like it's a band that like it's never going to be on when you're at a punk show and they got the DJ going ahead of time and Grimple were to come on. That's like a good time in my opinion.
Right. I think that I give it an absolute A++. I think that it's one of those things where it really fits with the Operation Ivy stuff to me. Not quite as iconic and good, but very close. I like it. I like it almost as much. If I wasn't such a Rancid fan, let's say if Rancid had never come around, this might be as important as Operation Ivy was to me. Because I was a Rancid fan before an Operation Ivy fan. I was young, so I found them, and then I found Operation Ivy because of Rancid.
That kind of backwards path, yeah.
It's attached to me in a different way. But had Rancid ever happened, I might have gotten to these two bands and been like, "Oh, these sound similar enough. I like this the same." Mm-hmm. So I put it in that category. S tier band for me. Yeah, I think it falls right in the middle spot of like A and S tier for me personally.
Well, I would say because your action figure comes with a Grimple patch on it, probably if they ever made an action figure, right? So that's pretty high praise.
Yeah. I mean, I literally was going to give this hoodie away, and the only thing I was going to do to it was take off the Grimple patch and keep it. Yeah. Like that's the only thing. I have a giant Rancid back patch that's like hand sewn in. And I was going to leave that on, but take the Grimple patch. Like that should tell people something about
very much part of your identity, I feel like.
Yeah, it sounds like me. That band sound. If I was to go here, listen to this, and if I was to make a mixtape, it would probably be Operation Ivy, Grimple, NoFX, and Rancid. And I would go here, listen to this, and probably some early Pennywise too, honestly.